The moment Leela stepped into Whispering Hollow, an oppressive stillness enveloped her. The forest was alive, but not in a comforting way. Every rustle felt intentional, every snap of a twig calculated. Sunlight struggled to break through the canopy, leaving the ground bathed in murky shadows. As she adjusted her camera, she caught a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. "Just a squirrel," she muttered, her voice breaking the eerie silence. But the echo that followed wasn't hers. It came back, warped and drawn out, as though someone had dragged her words through static. "Just a squirrel." Her pulse quickened, but she steadied herself. It was a phenomenon, she reminded herself. Sound bouncing off the natural formations of the forest. Nothing more. She trudged deeper, her boots crunching over fallen leaves. The trees grew denser, and the light dimmed. It felt as though the forest was leaning in, pressing against her with unseen hands. She stopped to take a shot of an ancient, gnarled tree covered in moss. Her finger hovered over the shutter, and that's when she heard it. "Come closer." It was her voice, but it wasn't coming from her. The sound was faint, drifting through the trees like smoke. She whipped around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. No one. Her hand trembled as she snapped the photo, the camera's click sounding deafening in the silence. The forest seemed endless, the trails looping back on themselves. She checked her map, but it didn't make sense. The landmarks she passed should have been miles apart, but they appeared within minutes of each other. And then there were the carvings, symbols, jagged and crude, etched into tree trunks. Some were fresh, the bark still raw and bleeding sap. Others were weathered, ancient, their meanings long forgotten. She reached out to touch one, but a cold wind whipped through the forest, chilling her to the bone. The whisper returned, closer this time. "Don't touch." She jerked her hand back, stumbling over a root. Her camera fell to the ground, lens cracking against the rocks. She cursed, picking it up to inspect the damage. When she looked up, the path ahead had changed. There was a cabin. The structure was dilapidated, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and decay. The windows were dark, but as Leela approached, she swore she saw movement inside. A flicker of a shadow, gone as quickly as it appeared. "This is how people disappear," she whispered to herself. And yet, she stepped closer. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on rusted hinges. Her fingers brushed the wood, and the whisper came again, louder this time. "Don't go." Her heart pounded as she pushed the door open. The interior was worse than she imagined. The walls were covered in more carvings, symbols overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. In the center of the room, a single chair faced a shattered mirror. She approached the mirror cautiously, her breath fogging the glass. At first, her reflection looked normal, but then it smiled. Leela wasn't smiling. The reflection raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. Leela stumbled back as the surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. The whisper turned into a chorus, a cacophony of voices overlapping. Her own voice was among them. "Come closer," it urged. "Help us." Leela bolted out of the cabin, the forest blurring around her. The symbols on the trees seemed to glow now, pulsating with a sickly light. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more desperate. She tripped over roots and branches, her knees scraping against the ground. When she looked up, the trail was gone. "Where are you going?" Her own voice rang out ahead of her. She froze, her chest heaving as she scanned the darkness. And then she saw it herself, or something that looked like her, stepping out from between the trees. Its face was pale, its eyes hollow and black. It smiled, but it was wrong. Too wide, too sharp. "You can't leave," it said. "You're part of this now." The next few hours were a blur of terror and desperation. No matter where she ran, the forest pulled her back. The doppelganger appeared again and again, blocking her path, whispering in her ear. The forest was alive, and it wanted her. When the first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy, she found herself back at the cabin. Her camera was gone, and her hands were scratched and bloody. The door creaked open, inviting her in. This time, she didn't resist. The chair was waiting, and so was the mirror. She sat down, her reflection grinning back at her. The voices quieted as the mirror rippled once more. And then, silence. When a search party entered Whispering Hollow weeks later, all they found was her broken camera, lying outside the cabin. Aya, a young teacher with a limited budget, felt she'd struck gold when she found the small apartment in Kyoto. The landlord had told her had been vacant for months, so he was willing to rent it at a low price. She didn't question why. It was cozy, and its proximity to her school was perfect. The first night was uneventful, save for the occasional creak of the building settling. However, as she prepared for bed on the second night, she heard footsteps pacing in the room above. Strange, she thought. The landlord hadn't mentioned an upstairs tenant. By the third night, the pacing became more distinct, almost rhythmic, as if someone were deliberately measuring the space. Growing uneasy, Ya asked a neighbor about the occupant above her. The neighbor's face darkened. "There is no upstairs," they said hesitantly. "Room 4B is on the top floor." Aya's heart sank. The dread builds. Trying to rationalize the sounds, Aya convinced herself that old buildings had quirks. But then other things began to happen. Items in her apartment seemed to shift when she wasn't looking. A cup turned slightly. A book left open to a page she hadn't read. Once, she found her phone in the refrigerator. One night, as she lay in bed, she was startled awake by a loud bang. Her bedroom door had slammed shut. Trembling, she turned on the light and crept toward the door. When she opened it, she found no one. But when she turned back, her mirror caught her attention. Her reflection was smiling at her. Aya screamed and covered the mirror with a towel. From then on, she avoided looking into reflective surfaces. Seeking help. Desperate, she contacted the landlord. His reaction was disturbingly calm. "You've seen her, haven't you?" he asked, his tone resigned. "Seen who?" Aya demanded. "The silent tenant," he said. "She's been here longer than any of us. She doesn't like people leaving." The landlord explained that years ago, a woman had lived in room 4B. She was quiet, unassuming, and reclusive. One day, she stopped paying rent. When the landlord entered to evict her, he found the apartment empty. There were no signs she had moved out. Her belongings were still there, and a pot of tea sat cold on the table. "She never left," he whispered. That night, Aya decided to leave. She packed her belongings in a rush and planned to stay at a friend's house. But as she reached for the doorknob, the apartment suddenly plunged into darkness. From the corner of the room came the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heading toward her. Aya clutched her phone, its flashlight trembling in her grip. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice breaking. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, pale and expressionless, with empty eyes and a smile that stretched unnaturally wide. Aya's flashlight flickered and died. The next thing she remembered was waking up on the floor, her belongings scattered around her. The apartment was eerily silent. Aya fled to her friend's house, vowing never to return. But the silent tenant wasn't done with her. At her friend's home, mirrors began to distort her reflection, showing glimpses of the pale woman. Shadows moved in corners where there shouldn't have been any. Aya finally sought the help of a local shaman, who told her the spirit was attached to the apartment but had latched onto her. To sever the connection, she had to return to room 4B and perform a ritual at midnight. With candles and a trembling resolve, Aya faced her fears one last time. She chanted the words given by the shaman, her voice shaking. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. The silent tenant appeared again, her smile now a grimace. Aya closed her eyes and finished the chant. When she opened them, the room was empty. The silent tenant was gone. Aya never went back to room 4B. The apartment remained vacant, and the landlord never found another tenant. However, Aya sometimes feels the silent tenant's gaze when she passes by reflective surfaces. They say room 4B is still waiting for its next occupant. Rachel had always been fascinated by antiques. Her passion for collecting old objects led her to a small, obscure shop in a quiet corner of her city. Among the countless dusty relics, one item stood out: a doll, perched on a shelf like it had been waiting for her. It was an intricately carved porcelain doll with dark eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved. Despite its delicate, almost serene appearance, there was something unsettling about it. The shopkeeper noticed Rachel's interest and smiled knowingly. "She's a rare find. Comes from a family with a tragic history," he said softly. Rachel, intrigued by the doll's haunting beauty, agreed to buy it, unaware that she was about to invite something far darker into her life. That night, after placing the doll on her mantelpiece, Rachel felt a shift in the atmosphere of her apartment. It was subtle at first, an uncomfortable chill in the air, whispers that seemed to drift through the walls, but it grew quickly. She tried to shrug it off as her imagination running wild, but the whispers continued, growing louder each night. One evening, as she sat on the couch reading, she heard it clearly. Rachel. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was an unmistakable malice in its tone. She jumped up, heart pounding. The doll was in the same place, its eyes staring directly at her. Though the whispers were no longer coming from the walls, they were coming from the doll itself. Rachel's first instinct was to get rid of the doll, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. It was as though the doll had cast a spell on her, making her feel an inexplicable attachment. She found herself cleaning it every day, adjusting its position on the mantle, and even speaking to it. Then the dream started. Night after night, Rachel dreamed of a woman with hollow eyes and a cracked, blood-stained dress. The woman would stare at her in silence, but Rachel could feel the weight of her sorrow. The dreams intensified as the whispers grew louder in waking hours. One night, Rachel woke up to find the doll sitting on her bed, staring at her with a gaze that seemed far too lifelike. The whispers echoed in her ears. "You're mine now, Rachel." Terrified, Rachel reached out to a paranormal investigator, hoping for answers. The investigator explained that the doll was cursed, passed down through generations of a family with a tragic history of loss, betrayal, and dark rituals. It was said that the doll trapped the soul of its original owner, a woman named Elena, who had died under mysterious circumstances. The doll, in turn, would slowly claim the soul of anyone who owned it. Desperate to rid herself of the doll, Rachel attempted to burn it, but when the flames touched the porcelain, the room filled with the sound of anguished wails, and the fire suddenly went out. The doll remained unscathed, its eerie presence stronger than ever. Rachel's health deteriorated rapidly. She began losing sleep, her skin grew pale, and she developed an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers were constant, now urging her to join Elena, to become a part of the doll's cursed lineage. One night, after yet another tormenting encounter, Rachel decided that the only way to end the curse was to return the doll to its original home. The investigator had told her that the doll's curse could only be broken if it was returned to the place where it had originated. Rachel traveled to the small village where the doll had been made, a secluded, desolate place surrounded by dense woods. As she entered the decrepit house where Elena had lived, she felt the presence of something cold and malicious. The house seemed alive with shadows, and the whispers followed her through every room. At the heart of the home, Rachel found a locked chest, ancient and covered in dust. Inside was the final piece of the puzzle, a journal that detailed Elena's life, and the horrific ritual that had bound her soul to the doll. With trembling hands, Rachel placed the doll inside the chest, and the whispers grew deafening. But as she closed the lid, silence fell. The oppressive weight that had clung to her for months lifted. The air felt lighter, and the sense of being watched disappeared. Rachel returned home, forever changed. The whispers stopped, and the doll was gone. But every now and then, when she walks past an antique shop, she feels a chill run down her spine. In the corner of her eye, she swears she sees a doll with dark eyes staring at her. It was a moonless night when Eric found himself driving down an unfamiliar stretch of highway. He had taken a detour to avoid traffic, trusting his GPS to guide him through the winding back roads. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and the only sounds were the hum of his car engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. As the clock on his dashboard struck 3:00 a.m., Eric noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her long black hair cascading over her face. She raised a hand, signaling for a ride. Eric hesitated. Every fiber of his being screamed to keep driving, but something about her seemed desperate. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" he asked cautiously. The woman didn't respond but slowly nodded. Her face remained hidden by her hair, and she didn't make a move to approach the car. Eric gestured to the passenger seat. "Get in. I can take you somewhere safe." The woman opened the door, and slid into the seat without a word. The air in the car grew cold instantly, and Eric felt a shiver run down his spine. A quiet passenger. Eric tried to make small talk as they drove. "So, where are you headed?" he asked, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. She remained silent, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the dashboard. Eric's unease grew, but he forced himself to focus on the road. After a few minutes, she finally spoke, her voice soft and almost melodic. "I need to go home." "Where's home?" Eric asked. She didn't answer but pointed ahead. Eric followed her direction, turning down an even narrower road lined with dense trees. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the oppressive silence made his heartbeat thunder in his ears. As they drove deeper into the woods, Eric began to notice strange things. Shadows seemed to move on their own, darting between the trees. The radio, which had been off, crackled to life, emitting faint whispers that he couldn't understand. He glanced at the woman again, and his stomach dropped. Her hair had shifted slightly, revealing part of her face. Her skin was mottled and gray, and her lips were cracked and bloodless. "Are you okay?" Eric asked, his voice trembling. She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw her eyes, or rather, the voids where her eyes should have been. Black pits stared back at him, filled with a malevolent energy that made his blood run cold. "This is my home," she whispered. Eric slammed on the brakes as the car skidded to a stop. They were in front of an old, dilapidated house, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. The woman stepped out of the car and began walking toward the house, her movements unnatural, as though her limbs were being controlled by invisible strings. Unable to leave her, Eric followed, his legs moving against his will. As he stepped inside the house, the air grew even colder, and the stench of decay overwhelmed him. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the floor creaked under his weight. The woman stood in the center of the room, her back to him. "They cursed me," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "They took everything from me." Eric felt a wave of nausea as the room began to spin. He saw flashes of a life long gone, a young woman being accused of witchcraft by the townsfolk, dragged from her home, and burned alive in the very spot where he now stood. Her screams echoed in his mind, mingling with the whispers that filled the house. Before he could react, the woman turned to face him fully. Her face was now completely disfigured, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and her hollow eyes bore into his soul. She reached out a hand, her fingers elongating unnaturally, and touched his chest. Eric's vision blurred as he felt her memories flooding into him, the pain, the betrayal, the rage. He fell to his knees, gasping for air, as the woman's voice filled his head. "You brought me back. You will carry my curse." The room erupted in chaos as objects flew through the air, and the walls seemed to close in. Eric scrambled to his feet and ran toward the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. Desperation gave him strength, and he kicked the door open, stumbling out into the night. The woman's laughter echoed behind him, growing louder and more menacing. He jumped into his car and sped away, not daring to look back as he drove. He realized the road was no longer familiar. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their twisted branches clawing at the car. His GPS showed static, and the clock on the dashboard was stuck at 3 o'clock a.m. Finally, he burst onto the main highway, the oppressive darkness lifting as the first rays of dawn broke through the horizon. He pulled over, shaking and gasping for air. The woman was gone, but her voice lingered in his mind. "You can't escape me." Eric sold his car and moved to a different city, hoping to leave the nightmare behind, but the curse followed him. He began seeing her in mirrors, in windows, and in his dreams. No matter how far he ran, she was always there, a shadow in the corner of his vision. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard her whisper again, "It's time to come home." The next morning, Eric was gone. His apartment was empty, save for a single white gown draped over a chair, and a faint smell of decay lingering in the air.